Okay, enough of that. Enough of that. It's time to start. There I was getting all carried away with things. Let's not do that. Tonight we're looking at the Druids, and I'm really excited about this because there is so much about the Druids. There's so much information. Not. We hear about it, we see the Celtic knots, we see the Celtic impressions, but the truth is, in actual fact, the modern or neo-druidism, which is what it's technically called, is a relatively new thing that didn't start till the 1800s. And it's sort of, what's the word that we put with that? It sort of made itself the unofficial, official kind of original language, religion, if you like, of Britain. But in actual fact, that's not how it started. And so I do have enough information to be going on with. But it's a really fascinating thing for me because we've got this modern aspect. The 1800s, they were just hitting down. You know, these guys were all getting down. Everybody's creating groups and secret societies. They're creating philosophies. They're trying to put all of this mumbo jumbo into one hat that's palatable for them all. And you can see this across the board, across the world. The ancient religions, if you like, were being brought out of the cupboard. They were being brought to the West if they were Eastern. They were brought back out of history, like Mithraism, which we're going to look at next week. There's all of these philosophies that aren't technically religions because they weren't dogmatic. There wasn't a teaching that said, you know, you do this, and you get rewards, you go to heaven. If you don't do this, then you're not really a bad person. They weren't sectarian as the more modern style of religions, well, the last few thousand years. So these are interesting to me. Neo-Druidism has also got the little wee that goes with it because their claim is Ireland and England. They don't even put Ireland in there, which is really crazy, but England, Wales and Scotland, which is one little piece of land. But in actual fact, the Celtic or the Druidism was engaged in Norse philosophies. It was in Finland for sure and Germany, and I don't doubt they'll have a certain amount of Germanic or European continuation of this originally and ancient theme. Now, if you wonder what happened to these kind of things, basically they got quashed by Catholicism, by Christianity. When you had the Crusades, they were whomping across Europe, just smiting everybody that didn't believe what they believed, and that belief was very staunch. You know, there was not allowed to be another belief, and it's one of the most enduring issues with religion today, that whole it's us or nothing. And there's something kind of intrinsically wrong about having a holistic belief in a spirituality and then having an us or them. There's also that controlling aspect that to be part of my religion, you better do things my way. You better dislike people of colour. You better dislike gay people. You better dislike people that actually have sex or have abortions or that do things differently. You've got to dislike anything that gives power to women. I mean, this is an ongoing trend that we see repeatedly. And so you can see where religions essentially have been modified and moderated to suit those that are in charge of it. That is like having a company where the CEO is all powerful for many sectors around the world, and then their rules are the rules that they all abide by. So I do see modern religion more of a business status because there's money. They're making money. The more followers they get, the more money they get. And that's all of them. You know, I can't think of any that don't. So that in itself is a problem. So I do rather like the philosophies, the philosophical ones that are less inclined to sectarianism, the ones that are more encompassing, are the ones that bring the word lifestyle rather than dogma, I suppose. So when we have a look at the beginning of this, and of course, because it's so ancient, we haven't got any original pictures, of course, but there's three different grades to Druidism. There are things that they do know. There are things that have been found archaeologically and so forth. For example, you know, right off the bat, they believed in, what do you call it when you burn the body? Look at me go. Woohoo! Lost my English already. What do you call that now? There's a name for it. Begins with C. He wants to be buried or he wants to be cremation. That's it. They believed in cremation, and babies' bones have been found. And the Romans, this is in the Romans' time, they weren't very generous. You know, they very often would make out that any bones found, anything found like that, meant that they sacrificed. But there's no actual evidence that they did make sacrifices, the Druids, that is. And so it's quite likely that, again, the Romans wanted their religion. At that time, you're moving into the Iron Age before they sort of die out, the Druids. So you're talking about Christianity. You're talking about big inroads into having this one Bible in 600 AD. So you're really looking at this authoritarian type model of religion. And these guys are whomping all over the world, all over Europe anyway, trying to make everybody their one people. The empire, as it started, was always Roman. It was the Roman Empire. And we need to remember that when we start trying to find out where these religions went, where these philosophies disappeared to. So there were three different grades for sure of Druidism, with specific and very assigned roles. The arts of the bards, that's the bard. The skills of prophecy and divination were the ovates, and the philosophical teaching, counselling and judicial charges and tasks went to the Druid. The bards were the keepers of tradition and of memory of any tribe, of any group, and in memory of their own spiritual ancestry. As is an ancestral philosophy, there was a very strong belief in honouring the ancestors, finding the ancestors, getting information, and there was a belief that you got information today by connecting with your ancestors. They were essentially the custodians of the sacredness of the word. In Ireland, they trained for 12 years learning grammar, hundreds of stories, poems, and philosophy. They were seen as the keepers and the teachers of their information, of all levels of information, including battles won and lost and fought. So we're not talking about a small group of people here. We're talking about nations, you know. The ovates worked with the processes of death and regeneration. There was a belief in reincarnation. Oopsie. They were native healers of the Celts, and that means that, you know, for years and years and years, even in any other organisation, group or religious belief, it was the ovates that would come forward. And you see these sort of philosophies in things like Merlin, you know, in the young Merlin. It's a very English story. But in that you've got healers that come from different places, and they've all been outlawed. All of these people that practice magic have all been outlawed, and these are kind of based on the Druid story, really. Once you make something illegal, it's very hard for people to keep it alive, right? It's very hard for them to pass that information on. It's very hard for them to expand into the world as they may have done otherwise. They specialised in divination, conversing with their ancestors, and prophesying the future. It was a big part of the Druid philosophy that a person would have a spiritual guidance role for other people. These are probably our first psychotherapists when you think about it. These are our first psychologists. These are our first counsellors that could listen to a person's problem and they could divine solutions for them. And they did take it to that extent. Human life follows the same cycle, really, of birth, death, rebirth, the nature of, and its seasons do. There's this whole sort of cyclic thing with the Druid faith or belief or philosophy, as I prefer to call it. Everything around, even emotions and concepts, these rise and fade, and then they rise again. So they've very much got it down to a cycle, and it's a very naturistic belief, so it's very holistic, that you must fit into this larger whole. You see this concept of that in the Celtic cross or the Celtic wheel, actually, these never-ending knots. They're very craftily done, but they represent this never-ending cycle, that no matter what happens, there's more to come. Now, the Druids and Druidesses, there is evidence that there were Druidesses. There is no evidence that they actually held an equal standing. There's no evidence that they had anything at all to do with any kind of power situation. So it's a question around that. And modern Druids like to say that they had equality. Again, there's a question. There's no evidence necessarily that they did, but there is also no evidence that they didn't. And again, we need to remember that the Druids were quashed by the Romans. So they would also perhaps burn and get rid of any evidence that women held power. While I hear that, even though I said it, and I've heard the argument about that a number of times, it's to be remembered that Roman women did hold power. The Romans were not averse to women holding power, so that doesn't quite sit well with me, but it could have come a little bit later with Christianity, the actual belief system inroading. The Romans thought that the Europeans, and the British in particular, were less than animals. They really did. They were civilized. They had waterways. They were clean. They understood hygiene. And then they come to Europe, and especially they come to Britain, and people are living in stone houses. They don't understand about cleanliness. So they had a very negative attitude to them. They really did not see them as human as such, and it's quite a clear delineation when you go back even further to the Vikings and the Saxons, that there was such a derisory attitude to the other race that it was almost like the survival of the fittest comes from this idea that this race must be supreme. And I find that interesting, because if you go back further, we have a couple of races of man. We've got Neanderthal man, and we've got another one whose name I can't remember. Essentially, one dies out, and we descend from Neanderthal man. Now, it's a really fascinating and maybe tragic, because there is a cave, the last cave. I wish I could remember the name of the other one now. I might do a show on that. But when they look into these caves, where the last known that species of man, just like you've got different species of dog, I suppose, for want of a better analogy, there's this cave, and they know that the last families lived there. And they were trying to. Archaeologists have tried to work out what it was that made one survive and the other one die. And they came up with, one die out, and they came up with the idea that Neanderthal man actually learned to trade and barter, and that he also learned to communicate with other tribes, even if they didn't speak in the same way, or even if they didn't speak. Whereas the others did not do that. They huddled down, and their tribes got smaller and smaller and smaller. So when you have a bad season, for example, you could lose a lot of people. When you're in trading and you have a bad season, you can go and you can trade for what it is that you need. That's the kind of thing they decided ultimately, but it's all guesswork, I guess. The Druids were the professional class, really. They were the modern day priests, I guess, teachers, ambassadors, astronomers. These were the educated folks. They were the philosophers, the theologians, the scientists, and judges. They underwent lengthy training, sometimes 20 years. We've lost that. In a modern society, everybody's an expert or a master in 5 seconds flat, which of course they're not. I think it's a tragedy. I do think that we can learn things faster now, but we don't necessarily master something simply because we learned it. And this is where I suppose these kind of philosophies are phenomenal, because the person at the top end of the game, the person who has mastered whatever it is, they've gone through their learning, they come out there with a genuine, honest-to-God skill, whatever that skill might be. So essentially their training is the equivalent of going to university. It's the equivalent of going and doing courses. It's the equivalent of not just doing that, but also gaining the experience. Let's face it, over 20 years, if you are in training, you're with a master, you're with a teacher, and you're seeing the process. You're part of the process. You might be the scribe that writes it down and not actually making the decision, but you're learning and you're seeing the mistakes and you're seeing the good. You're seeing the right way to lead, which is a powerful thing to understand. We've got this interesting thing, because you've got the Druids, they led all the public rituals. They were the guys in charge, which were normally held within fenced groves or sacred trees in their roles as priests, and they acted as mediators between God and man, which is what a priest does. It's what a spiritualist does. It's what a person does when another is seeking help on some level from a higher source. So it's an interesting aspect right there. But they were directing ritual. They were shamans that were guiding, and they had the rites, so they had the process. So again, you're saying we've learned the process, we know how it works, and now we can share that process with you so that you can gain something, so you can get something a little bit more than what you're getting now. We can have a look at it. They're going to tell you, you know what, you're stuffing up. Let's sort this out. Don't hit your wife, or don't beat your children. Don't drink. Don't whatever. So they were moral guides as well. They didn't form a religion. They never formed a political entity, a unity even. They were organized tribes. So basically you had a lot of small tribes, which probably makes it easier to wipe them out, I guess. And they spread across what is now several countries, as I said before. Now, this is the curious thing. As a result of that, there are 374 Celtic deities, which is a few. It's like, okay, there's a few of those. that they've been found in over 300 occur only once in the archaeological record, which means that they're found in one place here or they're found in one place there. They're not repeated through all the different spaces and places. So that makes them local deities. That means that particular organization, that particular tribe, that particular group will have that deity. Now, they have common deities, but that one's just for them. So you've got this localization as well of this amazing philosophy. The evidence at the end that they come up with, and again, this is very subjective, was that their main pantheon of gods and goddesses might have totaled about 3 dozen. So 3 dozen is 33, but there is an about there. You see how this going, you see 3, it recurs through Celtic historical stuff, blah, 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 blah. Well, it doesn't quite. So we'll leave that one as they're not really sure, but there are roughly about that many that they see sort of through different tribes. They believe that the dead were transported to the other world by the god, and of course that's spelt B-I-L-E, pronounced Bel or Belenus, and of course you know that you have Celtic rites that include Beltane, for example. So there's these interesting rituals that they have. This is more modern, although it's an old-looking thing. It's more modern than obviously the early Druids. It is an ancient thing that did get lost a very long time ago. So I want to really reiterate that anything that we see that is fairly modern isn't necessarily going to carry the same weight or the same import as what was going on there. There's no need for us to really pull ourselves down and look at modern Druidism as the fact of what it was. I really don't think it is. I think it is definitely a much more sort of almost Wicca, almost Mason-like approach. The costume, all of that pomp and ceremony probably wasn't really as big a deal once upon a time, because it was a way of living. It wasn't something they chose to believe in and chose to do, which is more what you're seeing today in a modern world, I guess. That life continues to the original Druids. Life continues after death the same as it did before death, which I think is kind of interesting. So there's no real change. You're basically in the same place doing the same thing, but you're no longer alive on the planet. The ancient Druids believed that the soul was immortal, and that after a person died in the other world, their soul reincarnates and lives again in another living entity, either in a plant or the body of a human or an animal. And I find that fascinating, because they're the only ones that really think of it that way. But that has impacted modern spirituality, really, because we get philosophies now, or you get spiritualists now, who will talk about weeping for the dead when there's a birth, and it comes directly from Druidism. You're not going to find that really anywhere else, where this whole understanding. It's quite an amazing thing. Even after a person has learned enough at this level, they move on after death to a higher realm, which has its own other world, and so on. So you go from one other world to another other world, and then you die in that other world, and you're reborn in another other world. It's a very complex belief, and it would be really marvelous if there was some more understanding of the actual depth and breadth of that. That's phenomenal stuff, you know. At every birth, the Celts they mourned the death of a person in the other world, which made the new birth possible. So we're talking about a reincarnation. How do I put this? I know. So when you die here, you're reincarnating in the other world. And then when you die there, you're reincarnating back here or in another world. So it's an incredibly complex situation. And they have something called the 3 kindreds. The 3 kindreds is rather interesting. So we have the dead with the 3 kindreds. The dead are the ancestors, and move along. I'm trying to move my thing along there. Hang on a minute. Let's have a look. What's going on? I'll make it big. Maybe it's my little... Oh, there we go. So that's the more modern what we call neo-Druidism. And you can see that they've all got these almost nun-like outfits on, and they've all got the hoods. It's become very fanciful, I suppose, because if you go back to a certain period of time, wearing hoods and long cloaks would have been rather common, more of a fashion statement than a spiritual one. It is a fascinating thing. And also Neo-Druidism tries to make claims upon things like Stonehenge and the others, which have been proven to be astronomical markers, but they also appear all around the world in various forms, astronomical markers. And I can see why they would have needed them. So it's a very interesting thing, but I don't doubt there would have been spiritual or specific rites of passage. But the dead are the ancestors, and the Druids believed that the knowledge gained by our ancestors is not lost. And through meditation was a big Druid belief structure, or a big Druid, what do we call it? Hang on, I'm going all over the place. Where did I go? Oh, funny. There we go. We're moving right along. Here we go. The dead. It's believed that, that through meditation you can reconnect with your ancestors and relearn those ancient lessons. It's very much a shamanistic trade, if you like. It's very much a shamanistic understanding. It's the way of the heart, if you like. It's the way of nature. But if you are not fully understanding of what's going on, you can relearn it through ancient lessons from your ancestors. We can't help but draw, or I can't help but draw a correlation between this belief and the modern understanding of genetic coding, where the larger ongoing experience of your grandparents and your parents is encoded into your own DNA, and quite possibly an inner knowledge that pervades the belief in reincarnation to start with. And I play with that thought a whole lot. But one of the real interesting things is that, the question of, are they going inside themselves? Now, we also have collective tribal memory. When there were smaller tribes and smaller groups, the collection of DNA within that group could be quite a small thing. So there's a closer understanding of each other. There's a closer bonding. I find it really fascinating, to be honest. And we are talking, somewhere in the region of 3,000 or 4,000 BC, going further back, because nobody really knows how far back the Druids go. They had a moral code. The virtue of honour requires one to adhere to their oath and do the right thing. Now, in the modern spirituality, in the modern Wiccan way, basically it's for the good of all, right? We always say that, it's for the good of all. But is that realistic? If something is the right thing to do and somebody else may be damaged by doing that right thing, you're in a different ballpark. And they actually believed in that honouring, the virtue of honour, requires that even if it is going to hurt somebody, you must always do the right thing. It doesn't matter if it hurts yourself or somebody else in that process. You must always do the right thing. So that's almost like a super honest tenet, isn't it? It's one of those things that really brings out that thought and that feeling or that understanding that, life's just amazing, that it's just holding itself in a particular place where honesty is more important than anything else. Wouldn't that be nice? A Druid is obligated to remain true to friends, family and leaders, thus exhibiting the virtue of loyalty. So loyalty is in there. We've got honour and loyalty. Hospitality demands that a Druid be a good host when guests are under one's roof. Honesty insists that one tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, do we wonder if those lines come from Druidism? That's a good question. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. It's a powerful thing. You must be true to yourself, but you also must be true to your gods and your people. So you've got a lot of truths you've got to engage, which means basically you need to walk your talk. You need to engage in the things you believe in, but you also need to live that if you're going to be basically an honest person, if you're going to hold up that particular moral code. There's these fascinating areas. Justice desires the Druid understands everyone has an inherent worth. That means everybody has a worth. Everybody. And that it is an assault to that worth, demands recompense in one form or another. That is cause and effect, isn't it? If I hurt you on purpose, if I do something damaging to you, then there is a price to be paid, one way or another. Courage for the Druid does not always wear a public face. It's standing strong in the face of adversity. Where do we see that in spirituality? We see it all over the place. Alone or with companions. Sometimes courage is just getting up and going about the daily routine when pain has worn one down without complaint or demure. It can also be doing what you know you need to do when you don't really want to do that. That's self-discipline right there. The Druids are often seen as having been alone, wandering around in space and time all by themselves. I don't believe that's the case, since it's a societal structure, Druidism. You can't have a guy being all on his own in the middle of nowhere and have him being your judge, your teacher. You can't have him being all of these roles, conducting rituals. He has to be a spiritual head, or the head. There could be a combination that the chief, like a Māoridom and a lot of tribal traditions, the chief and the spiritual guider are side by side within a tribe, right? They help each other out. And in others, they are the one person, that this person has attained enough experience and enough knowledge to be a leader. And that if one isn't leading with spirituality and with a strong bent towards spirituality, then one isn't a good leader. They will always bring their people down. They will always bring their people to war. They will always bring their people to their knees in some way, shape or other. Divination of the Druids is one of the things that, of course, becomes very close with gods and goddesses. We've got a lot of talk about, antlers and deer, but there's no real evidence of that. We have got the strong evidence, though, that every part of nature was revered, and that the gods and goddesses that they do know tended to be animals, tended to be trees, tended to be part of nature in some way. And I just see that as a very normal function we see that with the American Indians as well. To revere nature doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing that as a god outside of the planet or outside of life. It just means that you're seeing them as a potential movement, if you like. You're seeing your gods and your goddesses as those that hold power over you. And of course, nature most definitely does. And when there isn't the balance in nature, you can lose something very serious, like your livelihood. Your village could become drought-ridden or flooded. Any amount of things could happen. Now, there's normal weather cycles. If you understand those very well, you can move around a bit and be in the right place at the right time, which is originally pretty much what nomadic tribes did. They didn't move just for the hell of it. They moved to the best place for the time of the year. It offered them food. It offered them water. It offered them whatever it is that they needed. It offered them shelter. It offered them coolness, if that's what they needed in the hotter weather, and so on, and shade. And, it's just all of these things. So you need to be able to read nature. You need to be able to live within nature so that you get all the things that you need from it. This is probably too small for you to read, but you can make it bigger. This is actually one of the most profound areas of divination for the Druids. They use many methods of divination. In fact, they were the most divinating people out there. They went from simple weather watching to sophisticated interpretation of bird flight. Yes, they would look at the flight of the birds and they would interpret that. I don't doubt that they knew very well what different formations meant. That would be telling them about the winds. It would be telling them about upper currents that you couldn't feel on the ground. It would be telling you by the direction that they're flying how far and how long we have before the cold sets in, that kind of thing. There's a variety of things. So we're talking about divination in a very broad sense when we're talking about the Druids. We're not just talking about reading the future or looking at the stars. We're talking about the whole village, if you like, the whole tribe's movements being dictated to by these readings. They would read the clouds. So if you're reading clouds, clearly what you're looking for is you're looking for the color, the direction, and so you would be looking for all these different signs. And I think it's very dismissive and ignorant of the modern folk to make that less than what it is. It's an expert, considered understanding of the environment and how that's going to affect your village. Should we harvest now or in 2 days' time? They're not throwing a pebble, and they're not going to a god blindly and saying, should we do this? They're looking at every sign they can to find the best possible time to do something, or to do nothing, or to move, or to bring the cattle in, whatever that might be. And so I think while they divined all of that in a way that we seem to think is unusual, I think a fair whack of that kind of divination had very good, solid purpose, and showed their understanding of the environment that they lived in. They also observed animal behavior, and they interpreted planetary configurations. That's where we've got these buildings, the astronomy side of it, not astrology, sorry, I might have said that earlier, but astronomy. Where are the stars in relation to the Earth and what's going on there? It's just too much, really. Almost each of the four elements was used for augury, which is an old term for divination. As they were used for healing, it's likely that the signs and associated feelings conveyed by the earth cast on a sheet or a drum skin were read as fortune teller might read the tea leaves. Having said that, there's always going to be a little bit more to it than reading the tea leaves. If they're that ingrained in learning and understanding what all of these little signs mean, they could even tell if you were likely to bleed a lot or not bleed much. While that sounds a bit strange, if you have been cut or hurt or damaged, they may need to look at these signs to determine what they need to deal with first. Do we need to stop the bleeding first, or do we need to make the person warm? What do we need to do? It's the best thing to do right now, today, this minute, based on the whole environment, what's going on. Quite a fascinating study. There's nothing really to study now. There's not much written about it, but there's just enough for that. But I also keep finding references that I think are a little bit dismissive. You know, it's like, I think they were a little bit more onto it than that. Even the shape of a passing cloud, or the images found in a fire, or gazing into pools. So they used scrying, which is probably, scrying I've always thought of as a European thing. I've always thought of it as something that comes from the European past, from the history of Europe, and moves into the space. And I don't doubt that things like runes, stone casting, these are the sticks that are used. They're all made from different woods. That's why they're different coloured. They're not actually coloured, or they shouldn't be. And used all the different woods because each wood, each tree, I haven't gone through that, but you can go and find it. There was a little chart there, and you can go and find a chart about each of the trees. They have an actual hierarchy for the trees. They have a symbolism for the trees. That is to say, you've got like angels, pretty much the same as what we do with angels, what we do with masters. We have this hierarchy. We create it. And so what they do is the ovate, the diviner, would scrape the little piece of wood. They would carve into it or write into it in more modern times the symbol for that tree, which is what I showed you over here. I'll go back to that. To the left of this, there's a symbol. I'll make that a bit bigger so you can see it. Each tree has a symbol. If you have a look, the Irish, the English, and the Welsh. So the birch has the little symbol there, and you can see they're all letters. Now, as a way of writing, it's very, very slow and laborious. But when you use it for divination, it becomes very much like using, I suppose, a Ouija board, for want of a better word, because they're not using it just to contact the dead, though. They're using it to gain information. We're also looking at what that tree, if you've drawn one of these, what does it mean? You know, what part of the hierarchy is it? What is its power? What is it giving to you? I learned the first light flower essences of New Zealand, and we have all of these trees that have a direct lineage of millions upon millions of years here. And if I go to the Rimu, for example, it radiates to the crown chakra, and it has its own energy, it has its own colour, and it's got this history. So when you call on Rimu, you are calling on 8 million years of direct lineage. That means the seed that drops off that tree today has a direct, uninterrupted lineage going back over 8 million years. So that's the fascinating thing. That means they've never been wiped out, they've never been reinstated, they've never been hybridized and turned into something else, which can happen in nature. It's not just something from Monsanto, where two seeds or a seed gets pollinated by something else and becomes a different line. And so when we're talking about lineage of trees, we are talking about that. They've got a direct line back through the earth, through the world, for how many millions of years. Now, a tree could go back, it can be 1,000 years old, but it can't get much older than that without falling over. And then we start tying it up, shoring it up, and protecting it so it doesn't fall over. But we've got this with oaks, and we've got this with different types of trees, especially in Europe, where this is what they are reading. They are using the energy of these pieces of wood as they come off the tree. They're using their own energy because they're the ones. And there's, again, something I bring up a bit is about, we buy the tools and we chuck them about and we expect them to be really honed in on our energy, our future, our life. And again, with the Witch's Breeches, where we talk about the personal oracle, it's to bring your personal energy into play, because it'll always give you much more information, much more accurate about you or somebody else when you do that. So the shaman or the ovate would always make their own. These are called Ogham, Ogham. They would make their own. You can go and get the list of trees and go and, I don't know, don't get caught, but go and cut things down if you like and bring them back. And this is what you do, and you put the markings on it, and you're away. It is a fascinating thing to do. And if you haven't got those trees, then you can look at whatever is native. I would go always with what's native. A lot of these we don't have here, so I would have to look at something else. But it's an interesting thing. Oak is still lines. In New Zealand, we still have oak lining our courts. Now, they're all modern. They're all modern. They're all, got fancy seating and all the stuff in our courts now. But there's still these balustrades around the edges. There's still the top or the front of the judge's area is all oak. Because once upon a time, oak was used for honesty and truthfulness, and they felt that a person who stood under an oak tree, could not tell a lie. And so they would, am I early? No. Am I? No. I started at midnight. You're late. Yeah. Okay. So they still line that, because once upon a time, all of the trials in England and possibly parts of Europe were held under an oak tree. So they would all go and stand under the tree, and the questions would be asked. The people were thought to think better, process better, understand better. They were all thought to do that under an oak tree. So all of these trees do have some kind of history with them. They also almost certainly sort of look at signs associated with feelings as well, conveyed by earth cast on a sheet or a drum skin. This is a bit gross, but they would have a quester that would wrap himself up in a bull skin. And he would sit there all wrapped up in this dead skin, and then he would try to divine, or she would try to divine. I think we're talking mainly men, though. It's kind of an interesting thing. But they also gazed into pools of water. So here's our scrying. They looked to forms of inspiration, but they looked around them for that. So I think that's a really early insight into scrying, which used and very commonly used in modern divination as a tool. And when you think about the gypsies and the old gypsies of Europe, when they would go around and they would have their crystal balls. Now, they wouldn't have been balls the way we see them today, so the chances are pretty good that they would have been fairly rough-cut stones, or they would have been a bowl with water in it, that kind of thing. There's this whole wonderful energy around looking to scry using nature. I'm back. Sorry about that, folks. And so when we are looking at wood and how it's used, my problem, nobody else's, and how it's used to, to link us with the environment, what's going on, where it's going, where it's taking us, it becomes this big thing all on its own. They really did take their divination seriously. They used it as a means of interpreting life, not just fortune telling. I mean, it could be an effective means of revealing hidden dynamics, whether these dynamics were hidden in yourself or whether they were hidden in the world around you in some way, a relationship or a relationship to something. Becomes a really fascinating area when you think that the level of which they use divination is very much in line with the way people like me, energy therapists all around the world now, are looking to using intuitive skills to aid the healing of the body and the life, rather than it's, even 20 years ago. And a lot of people do this still too, where it's just, is the bloke coming back? Is he going? What's happening there? Without a thought or a consideration to any actions that you may need to take. That style of fortune telling is a different step down, and you can see the two layers of reading. You can see the intuition, the divination with a view to guiding a person in life, which is very shamanistic. It's very old world and then you can see the more modern approach, which is just give me $5 and I'll tell you if something's going or something's not going. But there's no supply of information to how you could make things better. It's a different role entirely with the shamans of their day, and that's where the Druids sort of fell into. There was no delineation of religion. That means you could come to a Druid for help or live within a Druid village, and there was no pressure for you to be Druid in your belief or your structure. They believed that all religions and paths to divinity were valid. None are better than others, and one must find the path that is most comfortable. And most comfortable means it's got to suit you. Try and say that when you've had a few. Druidry does not believe in conversion. At least in spiritual form, it has no dogma. Either one is called to the Druid path or one is not. And that's quite a big deal in modern spirituality as well, because people are saying that, I'm called to this path or I'm called to that path. And there's a lot of loose qualities around that. The fact that people don't learn their craft or don't learn doesn't make them, more independent or free of spirit. The Druidism suggested that if you want to master something, you did need to learn it, and you needed to take your own good God time about learning something to make sure that it all worked very well for you. Druidry was a societal structure, that involved reverence for all of life rather than merely a religion or a spiritual practice. It's like the Amish society, really, where you lived the belief rather than you had the belief, and you see that as pretty much the norm for modern religion. I've actually firmly believed for the last number of years now that I don't believe that all of these people believe in the God they talk about. I don't believe they believe in their devil, because if they really did, they would not do what they do. True belief would prevent them. But they make way for their belief when it suits, There's this get out of jail free card if you go to the confessional. You can go and kill 50 people in your lifetime, but you'll still go to heaven as long as you go to the confessional and say you're sorry, kind of a thing, or at least on your deathbed. And there's no responsibility in that. There's no putting things right. And I see that as an outflow of Catholicism in particular, but Christianity in general, where the structure has committed so many abominations over the centuries that they need a get out of jail free card. They need something to let them out of there, because so many, they foster bigotry and, subhuman behaviors, all in the name of God, if you like. It becomes a very dreary outlook. But this whole looking into this brought me to the trees. The trees are everywhere in religion and spaces and places. You'll look through all of these Eastern temples, and you'll see trees growing through the temples because they wanted them in their environment.